The opinions expressed in the State of Mind program are those of the speakers. The program is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. It is not a substitute for consulting a medical or a mental health professional. Welcome to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well, broadcasting on KSQD Santa Cruz on 90.7 FM and live streaming at ksqd.org. I'm the producer and host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. Although caregiving spans across ages, according to a 2020 AARP report, the prevalence of those caring for older adults has been steadily increasing in recent years. Now, 1 in 6 Americans provide care to someone age 50 or older. This equates to nearly 42 million U.S. adults caring for someone age 50 or older, and is a trend that is only expected to persist as one of the largest demographic groups, baby boomers, continue to age. Given these trends, many of us are going to find ourselves in the role of caregiver for an older adult. Under any conditions, caregiving for your aging and dying parent can be a challenging task and difficult to balance with raising children and work commitments. Caregiving is a role that can be ever more difficult when relationships are conflicted. Interestingly, a 2015 study by the Pew Research Center found that most adults who have helped care for an aging parent see it as rewarding. So our conversation today is about the process of caregiving an aging parent and the possibility of healing both relationships and yourself while doing so. We're joined by award-winning author Laura Davis, who has a new memoir out called The Burning Light of 2 Stars, about her experience of reconciling her strained relationship with her mother while caring for her through her developing dementia and death. We're also joined by Chief Medical Officer at Hospice Santa Cruz and palliative care specialist Dr. Karl Segnitz, who will share about how families can navigate these end-of-life circumstances and find needed supports. Let me tell you more about our guests here with us today. Laura Davis is the author of 6 best-selling books, including The Courage to Heal and I Thought We Would Never Speak Again. Her groundbreaking books have been translated into 12 languages and sold 2 million copies. In addition to writing books, the work of Laura's heart is to teach. For more than 20 years, she's helped people find their voices, tell their stories, and hone their craft. The Burning Light of 2 Stars, her new memoir, tells the story of her embattled relationship with her mother, their determination to love one another, and the surprising and dramatic collision course they experienced when she became her mother's caregiver at the end of her life. Laura says she wrote this book to demonstrate that transformation is possible in even the toughest relationships, and that caregiving can be a pathway to healing. Karl Segnitz, MD, is a local hospice and palliative care and urgent care doctor practicing at Hospice of Santa Cruz County and Palo Alto Medical Foundation since 2007. He grew up in a large medical family in Lexington, Kentucky, and moved around before ending up here in Santa Cruz to be close to his wife's family. Dr. Segnitz trained in family medicine at the University of Washington after medical school in Portland, Oregon. From 1996 to 2012, he practiced emergency medicine, and since then has been moving into urgent care and hospice and palliative care. Dr. Segnitz is board certified in the areas of family medicine, emergency medicine, and hospice and palliative medicine. Earlier this year, he joined Hospice of Santa Cruz County's inpatient palliative care service at Watsonville Community Hospital, which is a complement to the existing outpatient palliative program. Dr. Segnitz says he enjoys all aspects of caring for people and their families throughout the life cycle. So welcome to you both, Karl and Laura. Great to be here.
Great to be here. Thank you very much for having us.
Well, let's get started with you, Dr. Segnitz. I'm wondering if you could just describe for us what the role of a palliative care doctor is in caring for aging and dying parents, and in what ways you work with their caregivers and families.
Well, it's first of all, I just wanted to shine a light on the fact that a lot of people call hospice and palliative care kind of an extra layer of support. And And a lot of people know that as a hospice and palliative care doc, we get to work with all the specialists and primary care doctors. But one of the things that's very unique about hospice and palliative care is that we have this thing called an IDT, interdisciplinary team, where I get to work with not only the patients and families and their primary docs, but I get a team of people that consists of a wide range, such as a medical social worker, spiritual care workers, nurses, aromatherapists, grief support, music therapists. So we get to interact with our patients and families from many different angles, not just a medical angle. So it reminds me in what I aspire to do in life, especially in medicine, but it's kind of a holistic approach towards caring for folks. So it's a lot of different roles.
Can you also maybe make the distinction for people between hospice care and palliative care? I know people often have that question.
Oh, great. Yeah, thank you for asking that. It is a very common question. And so Medicare outlines hospice as somebody that has likely a 6-month prognosis if the disease follows its normal trajectory. Whereas palliative care, depending on which groups you work with, is often defined as having a serious life-threatening illness with a prognosis of 1 to 2 years and symptoms that are out of control. So I think of it as routine care, what we all think of as medicine, and then palliative care comes into play. And then at the very last 6 months or so of life, you have hospice. And by the way, a lot of other people, including Hospice of Santa Cruz County, have something called transitions care. In the analogous to palliative care being kind of pre-hospice, transition care is often thought of as pre-palliative care. So a lot of groups around the country and the world are acknowledging that these different phases and integrating in a holistic way with the teams can benefit families. So routine care, transition care, palliative care, and hospice care.
Can you give us some idea of how many people are in caregiving roles for their aging and dying parents, and who's most likely to be fulfilling those roles from your experience?
Well, it's interesting. I noticed that when you did your intro, we must have overlapped. And if you look at the CDC website, if you look at National Institutes of Health and all the different websites, the number has gone from 1 in 5 or 6 to now 1 or 4 in 5 people are caregivers. So as you said, that turns out to be 45, 50, 55 million people in America. And it turns out that most of them are women that end up being the caregivers. And so, for example, in Santa Cruz County, I'm a rounder offer. So there's around 200,000 people in Santa Cruz County. And if you end up doing the math, it's as high as 30 or 35,000 people end up being caregivers. And most of those, I think, depending on which studies you read, it's around 60 or 70 or 75% end up being women that are the caregivers.
So, that says a lot about people and their roles. And also, what we often hear is the sandwich generation. And I know, Laura, your story speaks a lot to that. You not only cared for your mother in her later years and until her death, but you also had to overcome a big rift in your relationship. And I'm wondering how you were able to do that. And at the same time, I understand you were caring for children and a family.
Yeah, those are really complicated questions. I could answer those for about an hour or two. But, my mother and I, when I was in my 20s, we experienced a really terrible rift. And we spent, I'd say, the next 20 years struggling to find a way back to each other and to try to seek out a path of reconciliation. And, I would have said we had reconciled, but then when my mother got old, when she was 80, she lived in New Jersey. I lived in California, and that was actually intentional. I moved 3,000 miles away as a young adult, really to create distance between us. I felt like I needed that kind of separation to become an autonomous adult and to separate from her. And then that distance remained for decades. She called one day to announce that she was moving across the country to Santa Cruz to live out the rest of her life in my town. And, suddenly we no longer had this cushion between us. We no longer had this um, space that would protect me. And I freaked out. And yet part of me was really longing to see if it was possible to really take our reconciliation to a different level. Because, I was capable of kind of going through the motions of being a good daughter, but I was really still shut down to her on the inside. There was a certain coldness to my care, even though I was doing everything right. And I wanted to see if I could open my heart to her again, despite the fact that we had this really kind of grievous rift that had happened earlier in our lives together that had never really been fully resolved.
You said, that she betrayed you. And in your book, you said she betrayed you in the worst moment of your life. And I'm wondering, can you talk about what happened to cause that rift?
Yeah, our estrangement really happened gradually. It was really a cascading series of breaches that started probably when I was a teenager. As soon as I was old enough to start asserting my own independent personality. My mother was the kind of person who was the sun, and I was expected to orbit around her. And she happened to give birth to another son. And so, there was a lot of fireworks between us and a lot of conflict. And it was sort of one thing after another. But the thing that really made the breach um, seem irreconcilable, when I was 27, I came to her and told her that her father, my maternal grandfather, had sexually abused me as a little girl. And it was the lowest point in my life. And I really desperately wanted my mother's support. And she not only didn't support me, she attacked me, insisted I was making it up, I was inventing it. And that really cemented the rift between us. And then I went on and wrote a book, The Courage to Heal, which ended up, surprisingly becoming this underground bestseller. So not only was I bringing this up in the family, this thing that had never been talked about, but then I was, doing it on national TV as well. So that just, and I desperately wanted her acceptance, her validation, and she desperately wanted me to recant. And that locked us in this conflict for many, many years.
Well, how did you go from there to being able to care for her at the end of her life?
I mean, that's what I wrote a whole book about. And it was a very gradual process. She and I worked really hard at our reconciliation, kind of in those middle years, maybe 20 years after the initial rift. We both put a lot of effort into trying to find a way to basically agree to disagree. We left the unresolved thing sitting in the middle of the room and started trying to rebuild threads of connection that were not based on this irreconcilable rift at the center. I loved the movies, and so did she. We would go to the movies, we would go to the theater, and my mother started coming to California for 2 or 3 months in the winter. And during that time, she didn't stay with me. She had her own place and her own life. And I was quite resistant to her doing this at first. But the reality is that bridging that geographical distance gave us a chance to start rebuilding some positive tendrils of connection.
And having some shared experiences.
And I produced some grandchildren for her, and that I think the kids were the thing that really motivated both of us the most. But then when she came out as, when she was older and she was starting to have dementia, it kind of changed the dynamics all over again, because her, as she started entering into having dementia, the qualities that many people at that point have, she was, rageful, she was anxious, she was unpredictable, she was incredibly emotionally volatile. It reminded me of all the worst qualities I had grown up with. And so it really set into motion really like a second war between us. Although on the outside, I was doing all the right things as her caregiver. On the inside, I was in complete turmoil and really struggling to be able to be present and not be triggered all the time by how she was acting and what she was doing.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD Santa Cruz, K-Squid, Many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today we're discussing caring for aging and dying parents, particularly when the relationships are strained or conflicted. We're joined by award-winning author Laura Davis, whose new memoir, The Burning Light of Two Stars, is about her experience of reconciling with and then caring for her mother through her developing dementia and death. We're also joined by Chief Medical Officer at Hospice of Santa Cruz County and palliative care specialist, Dr. Karl Segnitz. Stay with us for this discussion about the complexities of caregiving and the possibility of healing within that experience. We'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Family Service Agency of the Central Coast for supporting this program. Family Service Agency provides counseling and support for people of all ages facing life crises and challenges. You can reach them at 423-9444 to see if they can help you. Thank you, Family Service Agency of the Central Coast, for supporting KSQD 90.7 FM.
Back to our interview. Karl, after listening to Laura's story, it's clear that caregiving an elder can be a difficult job, probably for anyone. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what you've seen as being some of those difficulties through your work as a hospice doctor, and what effects does that end up having on those who are trying to do the caregiving role?
Great question. Yeah, well, it's funny. I was talking to my partners the other day because we had a difficult situation, and the family was talking about the difficulties in their life was breaking up into kind of two parts. There was the logistics, in other words, getting the bed set up, learning how to deal with toilet, bathing, feeding, and the physical parts of the demise of the body. But this particular family was dealing with something called Lewy body dementia, and the patient wasn't able to always remember and be cognitive. And so the difficulty in this particular family was that the patient's mind was going as well as the body. And so it was very hard to care for somebody who the previous 79 years had been saying please and thank you and I really appreciate the help, to somebody that was getting angry and having outbursts after the loving daughter, in this case, and the grandson were bending over backwards to help the loved one. But the mind and the body and the mind had gone, and that was a big difficulty to deal with, the strain of having to rise above kind of belligerence, non-linear thinking, and somebody who doesn't seem like they're having gratitude for getting a tremendous amount of help. So anyway, so those difficulties can be a wide variety of things. And as we were talking about in the intro, I heard one of you say that in terms of the effects, the vast majority of people, even though they go through caregiving, which can be very difficult, find it very rewarding. Some relationships get hardened and maybe darkened, but the vast majority of people, when they're staring at the absolute need to care for each other, in the end, even though there's a lot of tears and sorrow and laughter and joy, in the end, it's a very meaningful part of life. And most people come up and they say, hey, I realize now why you do this, because I thought it was going to all be miserable taking care of the elderly and that kind of thing. But it's so rewarding to do something so meaningful. And so that I always thought is kind of something that I think it's the beautiful part of all this. So even though the difficulties are many, the effects, though they're rarely negative, the effects overall are vastly positive, because people realize that it's going to happen to them. In fact, it happens to all of us. So that part of it turns out to be a positive effect overall.
Are there any ways you could suggest that children of older adults could be better prepared or equipped to become their caregivers?
It's funny. I was talking about this with somebody, and my son, who's turning 12, remind me of one of Dumbledore's statements in Harry Potter, where he said to the well-organized mind, death is but the next adventure. And I thought that was incredibly astute of him, because one of the best ways to get prepared is just acknowledging that it happens. So there's a ton of logistics if one can see it coming, which we can't always. But so to be prepared, the most important thing is to accept that it's coming. I think that's a huge part of it. And I acknowledge the fact that you have to have caregiving, and you have to have laundry, and you have to get the bed set up, and you have to do a million things and get extra help. There's long-term care insurance. We could get into a million logistics, but acknowledging that it's coming and that it's natural, people that can do that seem to do much better. And one of my heroes, there are many heroes at Hospice of Santa Cruz County, and I was mentioning that the people that prepare for the end of life while they're in the middle of life, when you're happy and healthy and you prepare for it, it seems those people tend to do much better. It's kind of, it reminds me of all the circles of life, when I tend to use nature as an example, and I remember when I was really little seeing this National Geographic show where the guy was watching the wolf, and the wolf got very preoccupied in fall and just went looking around, dug a big hole, got this thing set up, and sure enough, she gave birth a few months later, but she was preparing. And so she did it well ahead of time. And so a lot of dealing with the end of life is seeing it coming and being open to it. And I think that's one of the major parts of being prepared.
Laura, I'm wondering, as you listen to Karl about advanced preparations, are there ways that you saw that happening in your experience with your mom preparing in advance?
Well, my mother was definitely someone who had like all her ducks in a row. I went with her to pick out her funeral plot. She had all her plans. She decided she wanted to get cremated, and actually she didn't want to be cremated, but she wanted to be buried in the Jewish cemetery in Santa Cruz, and there was no more space. And the only way she could be buried there was if she was cremated. So it was sort of against her. Especially, as someone who grew up with the Holocaust happening around her, the idea of being burned in an oven was a horror to her, but she said yes to it because she wanted to be there. But she really prepared everything, so, and I really appreciate that she did that. She didn't leave any kind of mess. And she, from the time she was 70, maybe about 75, she started saying, "I've reached the acceptable age for death. No one would call my death a tragedy." So she was very accepting, I think. And that really, really helped. It wasn't a surprise. It was something she planned for.
It also sounds like she made sure you knew what was important to her.
She did. I was very clear, and she really didn't want, she used to say, her favorite saying was, "If I ever have to use a walker or a wheelchair, just take me out back and shoot me." She said that many times over the years, and what was so interesting was watching how, as she declined, kind of her line in the sand of what was acceptable kept diminishing. And it was quite tragic to me. I mean, it was sad to see that this woman who had been so proud, she had been a beauty queen, so she was really into her looks, very vain and proud and strong, and that, she declared that for all those years, but, then years later, she was using a bedpan with no shame, and what was okay to her, her world kept diminishing, and it kept being okay with her. So I had to adjust what she had told me according to who was in front of me at the moment.
By the way, you just said something that I should have said earlier about being prepared. And that's, my wife does palliative care, and she's like, "Karl, whatever you say," because she knows I float away sometimes into the metaphysics of it all. But she was saying, one of the great difficulties of end of life is that a lot of families don't know what their loved ones' wishes are. And so I'm trying to be a little bit practical, and that is to do a post physician's order for life-sustaining therapy and your advance directive. The people that have done that long before they need it, it takes a tremendous amount of stress and strain out of their life to know. And for example, what your mom said, my wife knows when to shoot me. So she knows that I have and I don't know if, I'm sure the line will change as they grow older, but she knows my wishes. and I know hers about when to call it. So anyway, there's a lot of different aspects to being prepared, and having your advance directive and your POLST ready with the help of your primary care team or your palliative team or your hospice team. Those are really great things to be prepared.
You know, that there were some issues with that though, because I really wanted to keep my mother out of the hospital. You know, she had a few hospitalizations in the year she was here, and for someone with dementia to be in the hospital and to have all these procedures done that she didn't understand, I felt like it was torture. And there were all these routines in the hospital of, we're going to do this and we're going to do that and we're going to do this. And I remember close to the end of her life, I brought her in because she had fallen, and I didn't want to take her to the hospital at all, but I was like between a rock and a hard place because the owner of the assisted living facility said, you know, she's not on hospice, and if you don't take her to the hospital, she can't sleep here tonight. She can't stay. So I was forced to have her go in an ambulance, which was so disorienting to her. And we got to the emergency room, and, you know, they were coming in saying, okay, we want to do this test. We want to do that test. And I just kept saying, no, 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 no. You're going to do a scan of her brain, and that's it, because we weren't going to treat anything else. And I remember the nurse stopped in her momentum and she just looked at me. She said, wow, I wish more people came in here with an advocate like you.
I'm just keep thinking about it. How did you keep what had happened in the past with your mother separate from your relationship as a caregiver in the present?
It was a challenge. I think one of the things that happened was that the power dynamic shifted between us. You know, I had always, whether she was or not, in my mind, she had always been this larger than life figure who had the power. And I was always in response to her, in reaction to her, or having to protect myself from her. But as she declined, I started being the decision maker, and I started being the one who had the power. And what happened was, as she, you know, at first she was very feisty and fighting me about her independence, but as her dementia proceeded, she became much more passive. And what I found was that she was no longer the person she had been. Like, I didn't have the same mother anymore. I had a different mother. And even though she was easier to take care of, I missed her feisty self because she wasn't herself. And I also felt like she would no longer felt like she was a danger to me. And I was actually able to open my heart to her more. So it was a very poignant and challenging time, but I think that changed things. The other thing is I found myself getting really triggered, and I ended up going back into therapy when I was taking care of her because I needed help separating the past from the present. I joined and brought her to a support group sponsored by the Alzheimer's Association in Santa Cruz. It was called the Early Stage Memory Loss Support Group, and they exist all over the country. And we would go every Tuesday, and we would first meet in a whole group. It would be people with memory loss and their caregivers. And then the people with memory loss would go with one facilitator, and those of us who were caregivers would go into another room with another facilitator. And that group saved my life. Absolutely. You know, for the maybe year and a half or 2 years I was in that group, talking to other people who were dealing with the same issues I was, just was incredibly valuable. And I would highly recommend it. It could be so isolating to be a caregiver, and the things that happen are unbelievable. And, you know, you really need a place where you could really let down and say, this is what is actually going on right now.
That's an amazing story. And my experience is that when people let the team help the whole unit, not just the patient, but the patient, I was almost always with friends and family and caregivers. And so instead of focusing on just the patient, hospice and palliative care and transition teams and getting the primary doctor to acknowledge all these different relationships, you can end up getting help for all those. It kind of reminds me of that old saying, you know, when they talk about raising a kid, it takes a village. And a lot of times exiting life, it takes the whole village. And if everybody acknowledges that they can get help to the extent that they need it, some families tell us, hey, we don't need any help. And they seem to be self-sufficient. Other people when our medical social worker or our chaplain will say, hey, you might reconsider talking to your imam or your rabbi or your priest, etc. And so I'm happy that you were able to get some help for you so that you could better help her.
At one point, I went down, someone in that group suggested I go down to a place called the Caregivers Alliance, which was in downtown Santa Cruz. And I went in for the intake, and they gave me a test that was called the burden scale. And it was like you had to rate yourself. I think it was like always, sometimes, never. And the questions were like, do you ever feel enraged when you're around the person you're caring for? Do you feel like you're losing control of your life? I'm making these up, but there were like maybe 30 questions. And I kept saying, always, always. And when it ended up, my score was like 37, and I was so far off the chart in terms of being stressed. And that was the day I called a therapist.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD K-Squid, community radio for the Monterey Bay. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today we're discussing caring for aging and dying parents, particularly when the relationships are strained or conflicted. We're joined by award-winning author Laura Davis, whose new memoir, The Burning Light of Two Stars, tells the story of her embattled relationship with her mother, their determination to love one another, and the surprising course they experience when Laura becomes her mother's caregiver at the end of her life. We're also joined by Chief Medical Officer at Hospice of Santa Cruz County and palliative care specialist, Dr. Karl Segnitz. Our conversation today is about caregiving an aging parent and the possibility of healing the relationship and yourself while doing so. We'll also discuss how and where to access support. I want to remind listeners that every State of Mind show has a resource list posted along with the show, and the resources we talk about today and more can be found on the post for today's show at ksqd.org/state of mind. Now, back to our interview. So, Karl, we've been talking about the quality of the relationship, and I'm wondering, in your work as a hospice and palliative care doctor, how have you seen the quality of the relationship between the adult child and the parent or person being cared for? How does that impact the experience of both? And how have you seen people navigate that?
Well, it's like a lot of things. I've often found myself thinking that oftentimes people die the way they live. In other words, infinitely varied. But like I said early in the show, I think the quality of relationships in transitional care and palliative care, and especially in hospice, there's a tremendous potential for healing and making things intense. And one of my other partners the other day was saying that, when you strip away a lot of the superfluous part of life, you get down to all the good stuff. And it's not saying it's all easy, but I think when people delve into the most meaningful parts of their life, they sense a deepening of a love and appreciation for each other, so so the relationship can get much deeper, and they can kind of accept and transcend things that maybe they weren't able to before because they know this is it. It kind of reminds me of my old life as an ER doc. Sometimes I really liked it because you have to decide. You don't have the luxury of time, and you take a deep breath and you make your best shot. And in hospice, a lot of times we see people, they'll often think, if this was the middle of life, I would be really annoyed with you for X, Y, and Z. But now that I think of it, this might be it. And they'll often cry and laugh and get right down to the most nitty-gritty granular stuff. And so the quality of the relationship can be enhanced in an ironic way. I'm sorry if that was too circuitous an answer, but the quality of the relationship can be deepened and improved.
I'm wondering, have you seen pandemic conditions add additional challenges for those who are caregiving for their aging and dying parents? And if so, like in what specific ways?
Well, I was thinking about that and just thinking that it's like an amplifier of sorts. It's just intensified everything. I've seen people when the country went through the election that was so intense and the fires, pandemics, it kind of can just so I've seen logistically, not only are people going through the pandemic and social isolation, but it's really awful how the economics of it have strained people, so that it's made things in general, it's made things much more difficult and harder. um at the same time, I've seen people forced into the house all together, and then they find out that they're all working at home, and they find out that this camaraderie develops in sharing the burden of caring for a loved one. So it can go any way, but basically I think the pandemic has been an amplifier and made intensified emotions for better and for worse. And that might be an example where it's been overall harder, because it's been, I don't know, was it over 2 years, and so it's so the pandemic has definitely been hard on everybody.
So, Laura, I want to come back to you and your story. And I'm wondering, as you were able to step in and care for your mother, what kind of changes did you have to make in your life and yourself to be able to do that?
Well, I had to give up any semblance of control over my time, for sure. Um, and I had to keep my cell phone on, ready to receive emergency calls. And I remember after she died, that was a huge change, is that I didn't have to feel I had to field middle of the night phone calls anymore. Um, I had to work really hard, on a psychic, spiritual, emotional level because, time was running out. I was really aware of that, and I wanted to be open-hearted, and because my mother had dementia, she crossed a certain point where it was one-sided. I mean, whatever work was going to be done to resolve the relationship, and she had done plenty in the decades before. She had done her part, but to take it to that final, resolution, as much as I could get there, it was really on me, because I couldn't converse with her in these deep ways that maybe some people could if they had cancer or some other thing that wasn't, affecting their brain. So I had to do the work, and I had to let go of certain things that I thought I had to have to reach that point of resolution, and it 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 really required me to stretch and, find ways to open my heart beyond what I thought I was capable of, and I am grateful for that because I think it's made a permanent change in my capacity for compassion, for connection, and my ability to love. I think we're all expanded by going through that experience. I also saw my father through the end of his life. So, I went through this with both parents, to different degrees. And I think there's something very powerful about watching these all powerful figures fade and die. It changes you in a very profound way. I mean, I remember talking to my brother and it was just like, well, we're next in line for death.
In reading your book, as I was reading your book, there are lots of really sweet examples too of those moments where you're reaching deep to find that stretch, and you really speak to that, in the story. And so if people are wondering, well, great, but how? I think it really does speak to, that way that you question yourself or challenge yourself, or how do you move out of where you are in this moment to something more expansive and loving.
One of the things that helped me the most was my spouse, Karen, and because she loved her mother-in-law and she stood up for her a lot. I had this history with my mother that, where I sort of cast in stone her transgressions and all the ways she had betrayed me and all the things I didn't like about her and all the mistakes she ever made. They were set in stone. And her good qualities, I just sort of let them drift through like water. And I really focused on the negative, and I kind of held her in that rigid place of the history as I remembered it, as I created it. And Karen was always advocating for me to be kinder, for me to be more generous. And she stood up for my mother a lot. And I really appreciated that.
So, Laura, you're talking about the support of your spouse. I'm wondering what other kinds of supports did you need as you were in this caregiving role for your mother, and where and how did you find it?
Well, aside from the things I already mentioned, getting into therapy, the support group, I did a lot of reading. There were a lot of excellent books and resources. I watched videos. The Alzheimer's Association had an amazing library. I checked a ton of things out of that library. So I was, I think when we're caregiving or we're dealing with high stress situations, we become more of who we already are. And I'm a researcher, I'm a doer, I'm a make things happen kind of person, and I'm an advocate. So my mother benefited from all those qualities that I had. And I remember there was this one point when I realized that it was very soon before she died. And I realized that this was going downhill and there was no coming back from where she was. And I realized that I had to let go of all those roles and that now it was time for me just to be her daughter, and just to love her. And finally, after so many decades of not being able to do that, I could.
Wow, really moving. So there's one piece I want to go back to a little bit, Laura. You also had two kids at home at the same time you were caring for your mom. I'm just wondering what would you say about that dual role?
I mean, I don't know what to say. It's incredibly difficult because you can't do anything. It feels like you can't do anything right. It feels like you're failing your children. It feels like you're failing the person you're caregiving. And then your own life is, I was stressed. I was not sleeping. Just all my stress signs were escalated for, quite a period of time. So, I think you just have to get through it and get as much help as you can. And my kids became more independent, and my son was off at one son was off at college at that time, and my daughter became more involved in her grandmother's care. I mean, she was a big support, and I think in some ways she was a senior in high school the year my mother was actively dying, and I think she really liked it because it meant there was no focus on her, and she got a lot more freedom. I wasn't micromanaging her or attempting to, because I was on board with my mother. So I think Eliza benefited during that year when she was pulling away and wanting to start to really establish her separation. I think the fact that this was going on gave her a lot more freedom. So in a way, it was a benefit to her.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD K-Squid, many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today we're discussing caring for aging and dying parents, particularly when the relationships are strained or conflicted. We're joined by award-winning author Laura Davis, whose new memoir, The Burning Light of Two Stars, is about her experience of reconciling with and then caring for her mother through her developing dementia and death. We're also joined by Chief Medical Officer at Hospice of Santa Cruz County and palliative care specialist, Dr. Karl Segnitz. Stay with us for this discussion about the complexities of caregiving parents and the possibility of healing within that experience. We'll also discuss how and where to access support. We'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Del Mar Caregiver Resource Center for supporting State of Mind. Del Mar Caregiver Resource Center advocates for the worth and value of caregivers across 3 local counties through low or no-cost consultations, education, support groups, and respite. More information is available at delmarcaregiver.org. That's delmarcaregiver.org. Thank you, Del Mar Caregiver Resource Center, for supporting community radio. K-Squid, 90.7 FM.
Back to our interview. So I'm wondering, Carl, as you listen to Laura's story, what's the range of outcomes you see happening at the end of people's lives? How typical is her story, or how unusual is her story? And what would you want to share with people about what they might be looking at?
Well, regretfully, what I'm finding is that the prevalence and incidence of dementia type diseases is going up so much as the population ages that regretfully the story is very common. In fact, it's one of the most common, as somewhere like 30 to 40% of people on hospice have neurodegenerative diseases. It's not, a lot of people think it's just heart attacks and cancers, but it's not. So Laura, I'm so sad what you went through, and regretfully, it's very common. And the outcomes, though, again, are infinite. I've seen a lot of people, again, I don't know if it's the optimist in me or not, but I've talked to many people just kind of double checking myself, but something, even though it's incredibly difficult, a lot of the outcomes, not only does it improve the relationship to whatever degree it can between the caregiver and the patient, but having gone through that sometimes improves the relationship of the legacy of the kids that are left over, and maybe even the other parent and with their kids and their community, because you get to see another part of somebody go through trials and tribulations that are not always graceful, but against all odds, they can rise to the occasion. And so the outcomes are often, to me, the most meaningful, to see people shed their skins and find ways and get help and maybe work less at the office and realize that sometimes the job in life is to help your loved one get propped up and spend 20 minutes getting ready to watch their favorite show, instead of just because it's an ordeal to do something simple. So again, the outcomes can be varied. And for people that are open to it, the whole process, it can be transformational and broaden and deepen their life and be more positive. So that a lot of people go into hospice and palliative care thinking it's just going to be terrible, and they're actually pleasantly surprised by the way it transpires. In fact, I was going to tell you guys that I thought my first ever patient as a med student, they said, go to blank room, and I was going to see a dying AIDS patient. And all my classmates were like, oh, Carl, I'm so sorry. What a bummer. And I was like, well, and I was like, oh, well, that's the luck of the draw. I walked into the room. It was the funniest, saddest. It was this amazing piece. It was the most peaceful place I'd been in my whole life. And I walked in and I remember thinking, this is amazing. This guy's body was gone. He was laughing and crying, and that was kind of this aha epiphany in my life. Like, I really loved that energy where all the superfluous stuff was gone and people were really talking about things that were important. And I walked out of the room and went back to my grand rounds, and everybody's like, what are you so happy about? I'm like, well, not so much happy, but I just had this amazing experience where a dying man and his family and friends were as peaceful as I'd ever seen. And that reminds me of what it's not always, but it can happen with palliative care and hospice. And that's why some people, if you're open to it, can enjoy it and be compassionate through it all.
Well, as we kind of get toward the end of our time here, there are still a number of topics I'm hoping we can cover. And Laura, I'd like to start with you, and just, you've described the difficulties and challenges of caring for your mom while raising your family. And I'm just wondering, did you ever regret your choice to step in as your mother's caregiver? And do you feel any differently about that now?
Absolutely not. I feel like it was one of the most enriching experiences of my life. I mean, it's easier to say that in hindsight, because when I was going through it, it felt like hell a lot of the time. I mean, it didn't feel wonderful when it was happening, but I think some of the things we gain the most from in life are some of the most challenging.
I'm wondering, Carl, from your experience working with families with a dying family member, are there situations where you've seen it appears to make the most sense for an adult child not to be the caregiver for the parent?
Yes, very much so. And Laura, that was very well said. And I was thinking about how we had I've seen all these different permutations. And one of them, which I thought was fascinating, was that when the son was being the son and the caregiver, the patient would get agitated and be very distracted and symptomatic. And then everybody figured out that if the son was the son and let other people do the caregiving, that it decompressed the relationship in a way. And then I've seen it go the other way too, where people, a lot of times, for example, children want to come up and they want to have these deep, meaningful conversations, but the parent's not ready. The loved one that's dying is not ready, but they can accept a different kind of love. And they'll actually not engage in certain types of conversations. And if they are more adjusting the bed and changing the bed and feeding and talking less, then the patient is calmer. And so, and other times we've seen when a certain person shows up, everything goes to hell in a handbasket. And with the help of the team, the people realize, now is not the time. And sometimes, even though it breaks everybody's heart, sometimes they have to come very rarely or not at all, because the patient has so many pain and agitation and can't deal with the toxicities of the past. So it's again, it's different with everybody. And again, sometimes when people they quit being the caregiver and just are the daughter or just are the husband or wife or partner, instead of trying to be everything, things can be more loving and bring out the good parts of the relationship and get rid of the strain and stress.
Yeah, can actually help toward the reconciliation if that's needed. Yeah, so now I want to come to resources. I'm wondering, as I said earlier, there will be more resources than we have time to talk about today on our resource list posted with the show. But I'm wondering if there's a couple that you might want to mention that you specifically used or that you often refer to and that you really want to call out so people will know about that. Laura, let's start with you.
There was one thing that I used that was a lifesaver that most people have not heard of. It was a little device. I bought it on Amazon. It was called a pocket talker. And it was relatively cheap. It was a little over $100. And for what it was a substitute for hearing aids, because my mother was not capable of maintaining or using hearing aids. I mean, they would be like, under the couch, gathering dust, and she just couldn't manage them or use them. And I think I bought her, 3 sets of $6,000 hearing aids. And she got to the point where she couldn't hear, and it was really isolating her. And this little device it looked like a tiny cassette deck. She would have it on her lap, and then she'd have a pair of headphones on connected to it, and it would amplify the conversation we were having. And it meant that we could talk to her, and her medical staff could talk to her. It was a miracle. I already mentioned the early memory loss support group, which I would really recommend people check into. And the other thing is I recommend, this is self-serving, but I do recommend that people read the story I have written. And I think it will give people permission for a really broad range of feelings that may come up when you're a caregiver, and help people feel like, oh, she's willing to talk about that. I guess it's okay that I feel this way too. And I have posted the first 5 chapters on my website if you want to read them, and that's at lauradavis.net/chapters. That's lauradavis.net/chapters. And I think it can be a good guide for people who are in this kind of situation.
Thank you. Thank you. Karl, any resources you want to call out?
I agree with Laura. There's just so many, and the main thing is to reach out. But right around, for example, I find that we often use the Del Mar Caregiver Resource Center and the Senior Network Services and the Alzheimer's Association. And then there's also straightforward things like the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine. Their website directs people to an infinite number of resources. And AARP and Hospice of Santa Cruz County has a tremendous array of ways to connect to different resources that can help people at different parts of the life cycle, not just death and dying, but transition care and palliative care. So, and there's also the National Alliance for Caregiving. So there's just there's just so many. Once you start reaching out, they'll often cross-refer so that you can get what you need for your family and your loved ones. So there's a lot of them.
I'm wondering if you have any closing comments, if there's anything that you have not yet had a chance to say, or any points that you definitely want to leave our listeners with. Laura?
The main thing is that you can be surprised by the outcome. That if you had asked me when I was 28 years old and becoming completely estranged from my mother, if I would ever take care of her at the end of her life, I would have looked at you and told you were utterly insane. And yet it ended up being one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. So I think being open, that we really don't know what the resolution is going to be. And that over the course of a lifetime, we change, the other person changes, and circumstances change. So keep an open mind and, as much as you can, an open heart.
Karl, any closing comments?
We've covered a lot of ground. I would just say, perhaps I didn't emphasize enough that the evening years and death and dying is normal, and being open to accepting it and being aware of minor things like the fact that 100% of us are going to go through it. Just normalizing something can make space for then learning how to, well, it sounds crazy, but it can be a beautiful thing. It's not all bad. And in fact, a lot of it can open up for the beauty of life. And so I think I would, normalizing that life and death, it's a circle and it's normal, and not to fight it so much can create a lot of peace in people's life. And that's I think I'd like to end on that.
I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Laura Davis and Dr. Karl Segnitz, for this courageous and important conversation. And thanks to you for joining us here on State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. If you found today's show interesting, you may also want to check out episode 22 on the mental health effects of dementia on patients and caregivers. To hear more conversations about mental health and wellness, join us on the first Sunday of every month from 6 to 7 p.m. right here on K-Squid 90.7 FM. Special thanks to Jeannie Baldzikowski for audio production, to Jennifer Young for research and outreach, and to Izzy Weiss for social media support. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. You can find all the past episodes of this show on our ksqd.org website by typing State of Mind in the search bar, or subscribe and get them delivered directly to your listening device on either Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify. Or listen through your home smart speaker by saying, play State of Mind podcast with Deborah Sloss on TuneIn. If you like this or any of our previous State of Mind episodes, please help the shows get heard by more listeners by leaving us a rating and a review on any of the podcast services, or submit your comment at the bottom of the post of any episode at ksqd.org. In Your Voice are short segments where listeners get to add their voice to the discussion. You can either call in to leave a message or record an audio file right on your phone. Either way, tell us about a mental health experience you've had, something that's contributed to your mental health recovery, or share a resource that's helped you. Submission details can be found on the State of Mind program page at ksqd.org. We're specifically looking for In Your Voice contributions for 2 upcoming shows. The first one is for next month's show on the power of forgiveness in mental health. We want to hear your stories about forgiving for your own health and well-being, and also for another upcoming show on soul food, practices and activities we do to feed our own soul. If you have experience with any of these, we want to hear from you, and your voice may just be on one of our future shows. This is listener-supported community radio, KSQD Santa Cruz. Just remember, 90.7 FM, K-Squid, your ink spot on the dial. Stay with us.